Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, our first of the year. Hope everyone had a good holiday season. Hope everyone stayed healthy. Happy New Year to all, and thank you for joining us today. We have an outstanding panel to discuss a critical part of the energy equation, and we're going to get to them in just a second. One thing I do want to call everyone's attention to is the questions tab on the right side of your screen. If you do have questions, type them in. The second part of the hour, we'll get to your questions. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. So please submit them as soon as you have one that you'd like to have addressed by our panel. I also want to thank all of our partners and supporters. We are very grateful to the mix of significant institutions in this field who are supportive of our mission, which is bringing together diverse voices and perspectives to discuss these serious issues, and then working with government officials and others to try to bring innovative ideas and bring areas of consensus and differentiation to policymakers who are working on these difficult issues. So thanks to all of our supporters for your contributions to what we do. Finally, I do want to call everyone's attention to a key part of our programs and services, which is the Our Energy Library. You can access it on our site. It has the foremost collection of papers, reports, studies, so forth in the field. It's available to anyone. And so for all of you out there who are working on these issues, please take advantage of the Our Energy Library, which is on the OEP website. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sharon Burke, who we are very fortunate to have today to lead the discussion. Sharon is the founder and president of Ecospherics, which provides research analysis to the industry. She has held positions with civic organizations in government, including as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. She will introduce our panel and get us right into the discussion. So Sharon, take it away.
Thanks so much, Bill. And I'm very grateful to Our Energy Policy for putting together this very important dialogue today. This is an issue that I personally have been following, critical minerals and what it means for the United States for more than a decade. And we're long overdue to have this kind of a robust dialogue. And we're so fortunate today to have a really excellent panel of people with deep expertise and who have a really important role to play. First, we're going to hear, we are joined by Melanie Kenderdine, who's the principal for the Energy Futures Initiative. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, when I first got to know Melanie, I think, well, I got to know her a while ago, but the most recent time that we had a chance to work together was when she was at the Department of Energy as the energy counselor to the Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz. And she was concurrently the director of DOE's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis. We're also joined today by Morgan Bazilian, who is the director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines, where he's also a professor of public policy. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And when I first got to know Morgan, he was a really important energy lead at the World Bank. So he comes with a wealth of experience here too. And then we're very fortunate to be joined today by Aaron Thiel. Aaron is currently the legislative assistant for Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. He handles energy and natural resources issues for her. And before that, he was at the Department of Interior in the Office of Congressional and Legislative Affairs. So for those of you who aren't already aware, Lisa Murkowski has long been a really important voice on critical minerals in the United States and internationally. So to have Aaron here is a great contribution to the dialogue. So what we're going to do now is for about 45 minutes, the four of us are going to have a conversation. This is going to be a free-flowing kind of thing, not pre-scripted remarks. And then we'll have time for your questions and for the panel. So I'm going to start by posing an opening question to all four of you, and I'll just direct and we'll just go with the flow. So in 2018, the Trump administration's Department of Interior put out a list of 35 mineral commodities that were designated as critical minerals. There's a proposal right now. In fact, the comment period just closed 2 days ago to expand that to 50. Critically, it adds nickel and zinc, which is a big deal, takes uranium out, which we can talk about if people want to. But the point is that the United States is more than 50% import reliant on 31 of those, and 100% import reliant, I think, on around a dozen or so. So let's start by talking about why that's a problem, or why it's not a problem if you really want to be a maverick. Why is it a problem, Melanie, that the United States is import reliant on for so many of these minerals?
Well, I've actually been looking at this issue for a long time now too. Sharon, you and I have had many conversations about this. I'm a strong believer in maps to help with strategy. And when you look at a map of the world and our import dependence, as you mentioned, I think there's actually 14% of these 14 critical metals and minerals that we are 100% import dependent on, and then probably another 12, 10 that at 75% or more in import dependent. And I would just give you one example. We need rare earth elements, and everyone thinks critical minerals and metals are rare earths. Rare earths is only one category of many, many. But rare earths, 80% of our rare earth imports come from China. So there's a lot of tension with China right now, issues with the South China Sea, blah, blah, blah. And so for obvious reasons, if we transition to a clean energy future, which we are going to have to, rare earth elements become very important, and we need to be very, very cognizant of the geostrategic implications of where those metals and minerals are, and start thinking very differently about supply chain protection. We tend to think
Morgan,
of it only. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, Morgan, you agree with that? Is that how you see why this is a problem, or if it is a problem?
Well, first, thanks for having me on this to the Our Energy Policy Group. It's terrific, and it's nice to see all of you. I'm meeting Aaron for the first time, but look, the notion of mineral criticality is not new. The practice goes back as far as 1973, when the USGS prepared a report, and it said on the many mineral commodities that are important to the national economy, national security, and everyday lives of US citizens. So this is not a new topic. That report in 73 included many of the same minerals on today's list, including the rare earths, lithium, etc. Of course, their relative importance to products was different.
I was going to say, yeah.
But it's not a new topic, and whether they were important to petroleum refining and making of glass then, or to EV battery cathodes now, it remains the case that it's not new. And I think that's one of the issues here, Sharon, is that it's never been a top tier political issue, right? It's never got that attention, save from Senator Murkowski, who I agree was the best on the topics, as still is in the Senate. So the fact that it has never reached that highest attention level, and I don't believe it will, means that we will keep going through these sort of public cycles of attention. As an example, the New York Times put out a series of pieces on different, as you saw, different minerals in different places, and deep dived on them. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of the public, that was like, wow, the New York Times is breaking this story. Of course, they were not, and they're actually very late to it. But I think that has a lot to do with how we conceive of this issue from a domestic perspective. So I'll stop there on that.
Yeah, because I was going to say, as a defense person, it got my attention a long time ago that China had almost total control of both processing and production of critical minerals that are critical not just for the energy sector, but for the tech sector and also for the defense sector, more appropriately, and that kind of reliance is inherently strategically a problem. Aaron, do you have anything you want to say about this too, about why is this a problem? Because I know you've been working on this for a while.
Yeah, and I think both Melanie and Morgan kind of raised good points. I would agree that it is a problem. I would also agree with Morgan that it's not a new issue that's just all of a sudden being talked about. There's been a lot of critical mineral lists throughout the past. I think the critical mineral list from the Biden administration as well as the Trump administration is a good starting point as kind of a whole government approach on how does our vulnerabilities on the supply chain of these issues affect the economic or national security interests of the United States. And the question is, do you want to have another country have the ability to influence the economic or national security impacts? I think COVID kind of highlighted the supply risks, the risks of supply chains across, all sorts of industries, whether it's health, medical supplies, and it's kind of just impounded what could be the risk if there was sort of a similar crunch export restrictions that China had in 2010, 2011 over trade disputes. I think they raised the notion that they were thinking about it, and everyone's kind of holding their breath, hoping that they didn't. But I think, just the basis that this all of government approach is pointing to and saying this is a problem, I think it highlights it. And I would agree with Morgan that it is kind of picking up in just traction and awareness over the last couple years. And I think it's something that's kind of rising to the level where people are now looking at it and thinking about how have we gotten here and what can we do next.
That's great. And not to freak people out, but in addition to the 1973 report, of course, during the Second World War, we were very concerned about a lot of these materials, and both as a domestic issue where people were turning in their pots and pans for the war effort, and as a question of global, of geopolitics and sourcing. So let's just dig in just for a minute so that to help our audience understand. We are talking about materials that have been in use for some time, as Morgan said, but where the use case for them really took off around 2007, 2008. Why are these materials so important? And if you could focus a little bit on why they're important for energy, for the energy transition and energy technologies. Melanie, do you want to say a word about that?
Well, I just before I go there, back to the previous question, I think that when we set up the International Energy Agency after the oil embargoes, we set up the Department of Energy after the oil embargoes. But when you look at the data that are collected by both IEA and EIA, they are pretty oil centric still, barrels of oil. And I would, and I think that's part of this discussion today, suggest that IEA and EIA start routinely collecting information on what we're talking about here today. They need to change their, there are other things that, the reliance on electricity and, is your substation automated, those kinds of issues for an energy security perspective. But I think that it's important that they start thinking about what we need in this space so that I can go to the IEA website and pull down information on these things. But back to your question, I'm just looking at a list of fuel cells, need scandium, rubidium, electronics R&D, rare earths, batteries and electronics, manganese, steel making, vanadium, uranium alloys, fluorspar, aluminum manufacturing, gasoline, uranium fuel. Those are just an example of the things that we need, these critical, and everyone I just read, we are 100% import dependent, okay, for those particular metals and minerals. And so it's critical for the energy space, for the industrial space, and back to what I was just saying, we need more information on this. So.
Morgan, Aaron, anything more specific about the use in the energy, like, cobalt for electric vehicles and other materials for electric vehicles? We got an administration that's really pushing a big increase in adoption of electric vehicles. Is that dependent on some of these materials?
I would say it's dependent. The widespread adoption of electric vehicles among the US public is dependent on the price of that vehicle, which is highly dependent on the cost of making that vehicle, which in electric vehicles is the battery pack.
And so, Morgan, yeah, I can see you're taking a breath. Go for it.
Yeah. Look, Sharon, as you know, and the other panelists know, this topic has gained attention largely because of the clean energy demands, and largely the focus is on the cathodes of electric vehicle lithium-ion batteries, and so it's very specifically then on lithium, nickel, cobalt, or that's the main attention areas. So, for the audience there, that's what you're going to see in the media is attention on that, and whether Elon Musk is doing a deal on nickel right now from Minnesota, or someone is buying huge lithium assets in Argentina or in Siberia. Those are the kind of things that are capturing the attention. But do keep in mind some of these things that aren't even on the critical minerals list are incredibly important for energy transitions, including copper, especially copper, silver, and other items. So, going back to your initial point, so that's the framing for this largely. It's an incomplete framing, though, is the point. So focusing only on cathode materials, because of their incredible demand and because some of the billionaires have decided to get into it, just makes good press, but it's not the entire framing of the issue.
Well, I was going to come to this later, but since you've opened the door, let me ask you a question. So a lot of us have followed energy policy for a long time, and and Melanie alluded to this. The supply disruption issues with energy have been a problem for the global economy and the U.S. economy, certainly for my entire lifetime. And there have been, OPEC has been an issue. We've had lines at gas stations. It's been a major distortion in our economy. It's been a distortion in every economy that produces oil and gas, or almost everyone. That the so-called resource curse undermines transparent governance. All kinds of problems, environmental problems, social problems, governance problems. So here's a question for you, Morgan, based on what you just said. Are we just replacing one kind of energy problem, geopolitical problem, pollution problem, for a different kind of energy problem? Or is this, are we going to walk down the exact same road when it comes to lithium and cobalt, or even copper and silver, as you said, with the vastly escalating demand? Is this just changing one kind of problem for a different kind of problem, sort of the same? Or can this be different?
Yeah, well, look, Sharon, thanks for the easy question. The answer is no, we're not exchanging it, and that's a fairly dangerous, from an optics or politics perspectives, piece of rhetoric. And so let me explain what I mean by that. So we started, and Melanie brought this up, you brought this up, the understanding of security from a domestic national security perspective of critical minerals is still relatively nascent, despite the fact that we've looked at it for decades. The reason for that goes back to the same thing I said before, which is that it has not reached the highest levels of priority or attention in government or from consumers. So because consumers are not waiting in line to pick up raw lithium or processed carbonate, it does not, come into the zeitgeist or the consciousness of, and therefore does not go up the chain. The same, it's also true that the methodologies for understanding mineral criticality or security, as you could call it, are not all that well developed, and not nearly as well developed as how the robust and rich ways we can think about energy security. So, but answering your question, is it exchanging one thing for the other? I think the important part there is that we have to acknowledge there are trade-offs and there are issues and problems, right? So if we don't acknowledge that there are problems, and that's come up very recently in everything from the media attention on child labor in the DRC to polysilicon and forced labor in Xinjiang in China. That said, those are extremely different situations, and so they have to be treated very differently. And of course, everything has to do with politics, and so the priority of the administration and a bipartisan bill that gets through to stop PV panels or polysilicon in PV panels from Xinjiang makes it up to the top of the priority list, where the DRC and that is a very different issue, and the United States does not have the same priority towards the DRC, not even remotely close, that we do with China. So that's one piece. The other piece is that this is not as simple in some ways as understanding the global oil market or the increasingly global natural gas market, massive commodities, fairly transparent markets. What we have in critical minerals is at least 35 and probably closer to 50, as you alluded to, and maybe even a little bit more, of deeply fragmented, very small, poor price transparency and poor governance markets. So it is much more difficult to sort of group these things together because they are individually very different. And so all of that combined makes this a very different problem, but one that at least we need to acknowledge that there are issues.
And Melanie, I saw you raise your hand. Aaron, think about this while Melanie's making her comment. It'd be really interesting to hear how this question looks from an Alaska perspective, as a major oil and gas producer that also has major mineral resources. What's this trade-off look like from Alaska's point of view? So think about that for a minute. Melanie, what you were going to add to this?
I think getting this to rise to the attention of policymakers, there is a lot of politics involved, and it's a little bit of an inconvenient truth, okay? Because there is a suggestion that quote unquote renewables that are free and everywhere are not necessarily as secure as we might think they are. But let me add one other thing to some of what Morgan said about, and my earlier comments about new measures of energy security. We tend to think of energy security and fuels. These are not fuels, they're capital costs. And so the lifespan of these technologies, how long does a grid scale battery last? And because that is what defines the draw on the metals and minerals that we are talking about here today. And I raised this point at Aspen Energy Institute a couple years ago, and the CEO of a utility said, I am required to buy grid scale batteries. The manufacturer tells me I will get 10 years out of them. If I get 3, I'm lucky. And so I've actually been looking at ISO standards for a lot of these, the capital needs and requirements that you need these metals and minerals for, in order to make sure that we are getting some honesty in the lifespan of those technologies, because that is defining the extent of the energy security problem we're talking about here. So.
I think that's fascinating, and also underscores what Morgan said about this is complicated. It's not as straightforward. Aaron, how does this look from Alaska's perspective?
Well, from an Alaska perspective, you mentioned it's got kind of a rich resource or natural resource history. I think my boss would claim, and many Alaskans would claim, that no one cares more about the environment and ensuring that there's proper protections in place for responsible resource extraction than those that are operating up in Alaska. I think, I would agree that it's you know, you don't want to point out or say that there's equations between renewable energy technologies and fossil fuels, but you also, you know, you can't be agnostic to the fact that there are trade-offs, and there are, you know, you do have to get these minerals from somewhere, but it's also not just renewable fuels. It's iPhones, it's laptops, it's everything across modern economies and technology. And the question is, you know, where are we going to source these from, and what standards, whether it's environmental, labor, or safety, are we going to hold, you know, these minerals to? And if, you know, the concern is environmental, why is it okay to rely on Australia or Canada? You know, I think my boss kind of got upset when we saw an article that the administration was pursuing Canada's mineral resources as the 51st state. You know, from the 49th state, we have a lot of mineral resources. We have a lot of professional workforce that, you know, benefit from the good jobs. The communities benefit from it. And, you know, I'd be happy to stack and look at our Alaska and US's environmental standards compared to everyone else. So I think, you know, looking at it from a whole approach and, you know, understanding that we still need these minerals no matter which approach we go down to. And the question is if we are taking this rapid transition of renewable energy resources and environment or in electric vehicles, where are we going to be in 10 years if we don't have either domestic or you know, partner agreements with nations to lessen that impact, if we are going to be that much more reliable on these in 5 to 10 years. I mean, every report, whether it's IEA, EIA, IPCC, is talking about the demand for these minerals is going to be there. The question is, where are we going to source it? Are we going to be able to recycle it? Are we going to substitute it? But there is going to need to be a supply side. And I think Alaska is, you know, a prime example of where you can have resource development with environmental safeguards in place. And I think there's, you know, understanding that there are benefits to these jobs and communities, and that you shouldn't just look at partner nations or friendly nations to try and shore up supply chains, and that the domestic supply chain and processing is also important.
I think this question of the trade-offs, I would love to come back to, but let's segue into the, you've all alluded to the politics of this. You know, the Trump administration, the Obama administration did have a strategy on rare earth elements, but the Trump administration put out a critical minerals strategy in, you know, 2018-ish, around there, maybe 2017 also. The Biden administration has put out a new one that focuses on 3 things: diversifying supply, so what you were talking about, Aaron, but also developing substitutes and improving reuse and recycling. So how would you prioritize those 3 areas? And do you think they got it right? Did they miss anything in this strategy? Is there something that should be in there that isn't in there? So, you know, what's your review of this? Anybody want to jump in, or shall I call on people again? Go ahead, Melanie. I was going to call on you anyway. So
Yeah, I do. I could see you looking at me. I mean, I think you have to prioritize reuse and recycling because
Sorry, the TV just came
at
on.
least it's not a dog barking or a baby crying. We're used to all of that.
Congress is going in session, right? Yeah, I was going to say that's quite a ring on your phone. Glad to know it wasn't your phone. Okay.
But
It was the Senate C-SPAN channel letting us know that
they're coming in.
The recycling and reuse is very important because the alternatives are not ready. Okay, and so recycling and reuse becomes very, very important, and so I would prioritize that first, and looking at alternatives for these metals and minerals. That's going to take time and infrastructure, and are there enough of them there? Domestic mining, I think, becomes very important, and but there are a lot of issues with that as well. So I would put recycling and reuse very high up on the agenda, and we should be, I think, requiring it. So,
and this is an area where these minerals are very different from traditional fuel minerals, because you can recycle and reuse them, right?
Right.
That they're not, when you burn oil, it's expended. But when you use nickel in a battery, it is not expended and can be recovered and reused.
Right.
So that's so interesting. Morgan, do you agree with those priorities, or do you think they got this right with the strategy?
Well, it'd be pretty rare where I would say they got that right. Look, they use some of the right words, but those words are not rocket science to come up with. But it's nice to see it's not that much different from the last two administrations. Yes, diversity is always a good approach to these things. Yes, recycling needs more attention. Look, I think there has to be a bigger conversation about the balance between the kind of things Aaron talked about, which I understand, which is the domestic industry or the domestic sector, and how we acknowledge its needs, take advantage of the resources in the United States in a sustainable way while creating jobs and all the sort of good political rhetoric and real things that we need in the United States, at the same time as acknowledging that we also need to work as part of the international community on trade rules and transparency. So those are two pieces. And the third is that, keep in mind, and this hasn't been broached that much today, is that, this is a significant issue for developing economies in the world, right? This is a big issue for developing economies. A lot of them take a lot of their GDP from extractive industries like mining, and focusing solely on our needs or the needs of one country in general is bad policy, right? It doesn't work. We're in a deeply interconnected world. I understand the politics of it, but it's not the way to do something well. And so, we have to really play a role in this international debate and support some of these other countries and try to make a thoughtful balance between the domestic and the international. I recognize, however, that sounds naive. In other words, that's not how domestic politics go. The priority is clearly and always going to be on the domestic role for this and the jobs and those things at the state level. So just pointing out that, if you don't look out or look at this from a larger perspective, you are going to make policies that are either inefficient or just bad.
And that's great. And I think we can come back to the why some of these why commodities markets are so problematic for so many economies. But partly because the state often owns the mineral resources and the mineral rights, unlike in the United States. So the money goes straight to the government. And also commodity markets are volatile. So the prices rise and drop very sharply. It's very difficult when that's, the basis of your economy. But Aaron, I wanted to come back to you, especially since you were, you worked with the Trump strategy. What do you think about the development here of American policy and strategy on these issues? And do you see continuity or big differences? What do you think about this? Oops, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I think in the larger sense, there is a good level of continuity and urgency. I think the administration is kind of grappling with some of their constituencies, and the critical minerals debate always comes down to whether or not it's going to increase domestic mining, and that has its sticky points in politics. But one of the examples that there is a difference between the Trump executive order in 2017 and the Biden executive order on supply chains, that DOI wasn't involved in the Biden executive order, neither BLM or USGS. It was HHS, Commerce, DOD. And so just recognizing that these other agencies that are saying this is an issue, this is a problem, and the agency that's involved with domestic land management policies is not in the room. And so that's kind of a highlighting. That's one issue. But I do think, you can't ignore substitutes or recycling or the supply side and the processing side as well. You know, recycling is easy to start with because we're starting from ground zero. We don't have anything set up, and so it's trying to figure out where are you going to, you know, what is the possibilities. Substitutes is an ongoing process, but until you achieve a breakthrough, you're either increasing efficiencies or you don't have, you know, the substitutes yet. And so there's always going to be that demand, and how you can bridge the gap for the next 5 to 10 years. This isn't a quick process. I mean, how long does it take to open a mine in the United States? How long does it take even if you have the supply and the demand and the processing set up in the US, you're still going to be competing with, you know, Chinese processing that has decades of efficiencies built into the process. And this is a learned process that has to be done. And so I think some of the ways that there is bipartisan support across administrations is recognizing that it is a long-term process. I mean, the bipartisan infrastructure bill focused on trying to shore up, USGS and Colorado School of Mines with a building, trying to create, segue to try and get some of the students involved into these issues into the US or into the USGS to try and form those partnerships, to try and get those expertise. But it's an issue across, the oil and gas and mining industry in the US, is that it's an aging workforce, and that it's not something that you can turn off overnight. So it's really trying to set up, policies that we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, and hopefully, as Morgan said, hopefully we don't get them wrong.
Morgan, do you want to direct comment on workforce issues, since he was invoking Colorado School of Mines and you're an important leader there?
Yeah, just to say, Aaron's exactly right there. And at what is referred to as the best mining engineering school in the country, we don't see the same throughput as we should to support a vibrant, sustainable mining activity in the United States. And that comes from a couple of things, including making the narrative that the mining industry and these critical minerals are essential for a low carbon future more clear, and a higher priority narrative for government and for companies. And once they do that, you'll start to see that interest by the younger people to come back into an industry that has been hounded for a long time in the United States. I think a couple other things Aaron said really important on that side is that it takes a long time to get a mine going, not just because of permitting, but also because of vague or opaque market signals in the pricing, and also for the industry to see that there's actual prioritization for it. It takes a little less time to put up a processing plant. We haven't talked about the different pieces of the supply chain, but if you were talking about recycling, the places that recycle a lot have a lot of advanced manufacturing of end products like batteries. So that's where you see a lot of recycling, not where you see just the minerals being taken out of the ground. And so if you don't think of this across the supply chain, you make bad policy.
Yeah, Melanie, you had an intervention.
Yeah, I think that there's going to be an important driver in the not too distant future, and that is the carbon border adjustment that the EU is going to implement in 2026. And it's only doing it on a few products, okay? So you can tell what they actually make in the EU by looking at what products they're going to put a border adjustment on. But included in the border adjustment tariff that they are considering is embedded emissions. And when you start getting into embedded emissions, you start looking at emissions from supply chains. And the emissions from global shipping are included in no country's NDC. It's only about 3% of total global emissions, but with all these countries, 130 right now, last time I counted, moving to net zero, things like 3% becomes very, very important. And so I think you're going to start seeing a ripple effect from the carbon border adjustment in Europe, where other countries are going to start looking at the embedded emissions of products, and shipping those things around the world is going to count, okay, in a country's embedded emissions calculations. So I think in an odd way that the EU's policy is going to drive that. And if I could say something, two other things on recycling. I think that, I can't remember whose analysis it was, said that the for lithium ion batteries, cobalt, nickel, whatever, that about you can meet about 9% of demand vis-a-vis recycling. So that's a hugely important thing. And I have been looking, I'm very worried about rural America. I grew up in rural New Mexico, and the one center of commerce in most small towns in the United States is auto repair. And that's going to go away, okay, if you go to EVs. And can we turn some of those small towns into hub and spoke recycling centers for some of these things? So we could make it an economic development issue, and if we're supportive of it. So just another weird thought. And
no, great. I mean, I think the larger question about supply chain security and the changing texture of that and what it looks like, 2 points, final points before we go to question. One is for all of you to talk about, can we achieve supply chain security? There's a reason we are where we are, because China has, in some cases, some geological advantages. A lot of cases, it's a processing advantage. And there's a reason that they have that, right? They, including that a lot of countries like Sweden has rare earth elements. A lot of the crazy names like yttrium and scandium, they have those names because they were discovered or isolated in Sweden, but they don't produce them very much because it's a dirty business. So they're offshoring it to China just like we are. There's a reason that China has a comparative advantage here, and it's not all geological advantage. Can we get a secure supply chain? Is it possible? And Aaron, I just wanted to come back to one comment you made about the Department of Interior not being in the room. I hear you, but on the other hand, the administration did announce their 100-day review in June and the formation of a task force, and Interior is very much part of that, and they have a role marked out in the task force to look at domestic production and how to increase domestic production. So, and as I recall, during the transition, I was part of the transition. Interior was in the room there too, but I know what you mean, that we're not used to interagency policymaking.
There is an emphasis, and there is, I think there is an underlying meaning to them not being in the executive order, and I think that is a difference between administrations. Is one's, I think I'll say there's a difference of rhetoric that we hear from the Department of Energy on the importance of this issue than what we hear from the Department of Interior.
It'll be interesting to see where this task force takes it, because Interior has such an important role to play there. So before we have 1 minute before we're going to start letting our audience throw questions at us. Just the last question from me for all of you: is it possible for us to get supply chain security given the dynamics I just talked about with China? Is it even possible? Morgan, what do you think?
Yeah, sure, it's possible. It depends on how you quantify that metric, right? So that as you well know, there's no one definition for success in that way. And as also, better than most of us, this is not just an energy issue, and the DoD has been taking this seriously, as you said, for a very long time. And they even have the Defense Logistics Agency has emergency stockpiles of different commodities and things like that in place today. And so, yeah, can we improve security? Yes, we need to improve our understanding of what security means, or what criticality means in this case, and we need to move away from parochial understandings of security that only look at supply side things or the very flawed notion of independence.
Apologies for jumping in here. This is Kevin with Our Energy Policy. We do have a significant number of questions.
Oh, go for it, Kevin, please.
I want to jump in and get to as many as we can. So starting off here, first question is from Amena Syed. How many critical mine applications are in process, and how many of these have been or close to being approved in the past year? And how many such mines are currently in the US? If you guys can ballpark that figure for us.
Aaron, do you have
Yeah,
your
not a
most
clue.
I
recently
do not know
government?
off the top of my head.
Yeah.
No idea.
Well, might be something to look up on our off time. Let's move on then.
But I can refer the questioner to the USGS. They have excellent information on both US and global resources and reserves. So all your questions can be answered at their website.
The mineral
Can I say
commodity
something?
survey.
Yeah.
Can I say something on that, Sharon?
Sure.
And I talk all over the world on this, and the 2019 lithium, the USGS number said 35,000 metric tons. In 2020, 750,000 metric tons, and these are reserves. It's because it's either reserves or resources. I can never remember which. One of them is tied to the cost curve.
Reserves.
It's reserve. That's what I thought. It's tied to the cost curve. What that says is there's been a huge increase in cost. Okay, when you go from 35,000 metric tons to 750,000. Okay, and that's going to inspire applications for mining, I would think. Okay,
it's complicated. Let's put that in the parking lot for a moment so Kevin can give us another question.
Thank you very much. From John Perkins, what is the scope of current efforts to locate deposits of critical minerals? How much is being spent per year? And are estimates of known recoverable reserves considered accurate by those who are knowledgeable on the issue?
Well, no, and it may be that Morgan's the best person to answer that, but it's not like oil where, even though oil's not like oil these days, we had new technology come in and it totally changed what was the available reserves. So reserves means commercially recoverable. When you're talking about minerals, solid ores, exploring for them is really different. Anything else on that, Morgan, that you want to throw out there? It's difficult to have accurate numbers, especially a lot of these materials are very prevalent in the Earth's crust, but not necessarily in commercially viable quantities. So it can be really hard to have a true number. Is that right, Morgan?
Well, yeah, and I would just say to the audience or to Kevin, who's picking out these many questions, if this is not a panel filled
We're not
with
scientists.
Well, some of us are, but not USGS employees. So look,
Right.
the issue
not a
of
petroleum geologist or whatever. Yes.
The issue of potential is, as you say, Sharon, it changed by orders of magnitude on natural gas once technologies changed. We know, as an example, that there is probably the world's largest potential for lithium in Bolivia, but none of it is being commercially exploited, and that has to do with politics and policy and all kinds of other things that have nothing to do with what's in the Earth's crust. So, but I would, like you said, point people to the USGS if they want to understand the technical details of what's happening in mining.
It's a wonderful agency. If you don't know them, you really should look at their website. They have such good informational resources in this space, but it's just different because oil, is a liquid underground. You can send seismic waves down and kind of characterize a well. You can't do that with rock, but we'll let the geological scientists, the petroleum engineers and all that answer those questions. Go ahead, Kevin.
Excellent. We've had a few questions. Oh, please, Eric.
So mapping has been a big issue of my boss in Alaska, and Earth MRI has been about 30 million roughly for the last couple of years. In the Infrastructure Act, there was a nationwide mapping efforts, and I think it was like around 430 million for Earth Mapping Resources Initiative. So that's kind of taking those, but it goes back to the basic questions: is what minerals do we have here? And there hasn't been a large-scale U.S. mapping exercise for decades. I think, you know, it's going back to technology from the 50s. So it is very much a blind spot that, you know, that we have.
Thank you, Aaron. That's great, because we have remote sensing and other technologies give us new ways to potentially explore. So, sorry, Kevin, go ahead. What else do we have?
We've had a few questions come in on this issue, and I don't believe we touched on it yet during the conversation. From Wendell in Holland, are there special environmental justice considerations around critical materials, and how are they being addressed? Example being lithium mining on Native American lands.
Yes, this is definitely an issue. Aaron, I know, you know, for Alaska, that is very much a live question.
I would, you know, we have Red Dog Mine, which is owned by, or the mine is owned by Nana Corporation, and it's a partner with Tech operated. And so it's very much, you know, the Alaska Native corporations are in the room. They're making these decisions. They're working with other affected Native groups through subsistence advisory boards to ensure that mine operations are consistent with subsistence harvest. And so it's very much an issue that, you know, we're all for the environmental justice initiatives if they include Alaska Natives, because, you know, they kind of meet a lot of the definitions, and that they are some of the leading industries in some mineral extraction, as well as oil and gas extraction in Alaska. But a lot of their communities stand to benefit from domestic production.
I would say
all
the
over
same.
the country. Yeah, go ahead, Melanie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in New Mexico and have spent a lifetime looking at some of the these issues on Native American lands and Navajo reservation in particular, and they've been mining coal on the Navajo reservation up in the northwest corner of the state for, you know, decades, and they're shutting down the coal plants. So I might look at this as an opportunity to create additional jobs in areas that are going to be greatly affected by some of our climate policies, quite frankly. So.
And including, that's one of the recycling cases, is coal ash and wastewater from fracking. You can recover some of these minerals from that. Morgan, anything else on the environmental justice angle, or do you feel like that's?
Well, just a quick one to say, of course, it's not limited to the United States. And, you know, and in fact, the United States is a minor part of the overall topic of environmental justice and mining, and that the two ways to increase its possibility is to focus on social license to operate through a better understanding of the positive impact the extractive industry sector is going to play in moving to a low carbon emissions. But that narrative is not sufficient to gain social license to operate. And there are issues far more compelling than the ones that are being felt in the United States and developing countries.
To that point, Sharon, and I think Morgan and I were on the same panel when I said it's something about 5-year-olds mining cobalt in Democratic Republic of Congo, and the reaction surprised me was they have jobs. They are earning income for their families. Okay, and so we think of it very differently in the United States than they are thinking about it in Africa, for example.
Just to add, Sharon, that's an extremely important point that Melanie just brought up. None of the parents of those children in the DRC want their children to be working in mining, right? It's not their goal in life to have their children working in mining. It is a sad part of what is nearly a failed state and a broken economy. Not because that's what they're interested in. And that's what I said before. It's a completely different issue as what's happening to forced labor re-education camps in China and the Uyghurs. It's a totally different issue. So we need to take into account all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think Gwendolyn, you asked a really important question, and earlier in the conversation when we were talking about trade-offs, this is part of what we meant, is that there are some very difficult issues that you can't just say we're going to fix this. There are some really difficult trade-offs to be worked out. Kevin, do you have another question or two for us that you want to put on the table?
Certainly do. I think we have time for one or two more here. We talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of being, let's say, mineral independent. To put a different spin on that question from Abigail Hunter, domestic sourcing should be a priority, but is it even feasible to meet the critical mineral needs for clean energy and electrification transition without partnering with allied countries, especially when considering the timeline needed to meet climate change goals?
No. Everybody agree with that?
Yeah, the answer
No.
is no. Yeah.
The answer is
I
no.
actually, you know, because, and I mentioned earlier that I am a map freak. Okay, and I've gone through and done a map of the world that shows the potential forums that we should be discussing these supply chain issues in. From our top 15 recipients of U.S. exports to G7 to G20 to OECD to then and TPP. When you look at the countries that were part of TPP, they're very important to this discussion. So I think we ought to go back and reinvigorate that discussion. But what are the forums that we can use to start discussing and ensuring the security of these supply chains? And so those are the ones I'm looking at specifically. Obviously, G7 is most important for the U.S. And I'm going to have to get off a little bit before the end because I have a meeting with he who cannot be kept waiting. So, all right.
I didn't realize Voldemort was still alive, but no. Just a quick codicil to the no answer. I think from everything that the panel's been saying that we do need to increase domestic production. I think that, again, that's not an easy thing to figure out how to do, but to say that, oh, the world needs a lot more of these materials, but we don't want to have these dirty industries here. We're okay with that being in someone else's country. Again, I think that that's a tension that we have to work out as a country about how we do this. If you like the cell phone that's in your hand, then you need an answer to this question. Kevin, I think we could probably squeeze in one more question if you like.
Absolutely, and we did talk a little bit about this one earlier in the context of mineral processing. From William Ickord, the United States has a significant deposit of some rare earth minerals, but is almost completely reliant upon China to process these minerals into usable products. What is being done or should be done to bring this processing onshore?
Good question. Who would like to take a shot?
I would just say, I mean, the infrastructure bill did have money for demonstration and commercial processes for rare earth extraction and processing. But I think, you know, the trick is it's not something you can turn on overnight, and there are efficiencies that we're going to have to deal with. And just the fact that they've been doing it and doing it well for 20, 30 years and has been a priority on their end, we have a lot of catching up to do. You know, so can we? I think I agree with Morgan. We can strengthen our supply chains in these areas, but you know, whether or not we can, it's all about a measure of success that we're looking at now. And now the measure of success is not to be extremely vulnerable, but it is a long-term problem, and we're gonna have to have long-term goals to try and make sure that we're continuing on the right path.
It's a huge issue, and it's a huge issue, and I agree, Aaron. There are some good things in the infrastructure bill in that regard, and we need to. Everyone thinks it's all about mining, but it's not. Okay, it's about processing, anode and cathode production. You know, a whole range of things where we, you know, if we mine it here, we have to ship it over to China. Okay, and so I mean, I don't. There have been a lot of efforts recently on battery manufacturing, the LG Chem, and you know that big issue there. So we need more policy support. So it's Aaron's job to fix this problem. Okay.
And I see that
run, guys.
Thank you, Melanie.
Okay.
Thank you. Wonderful panel. And
you.
I see that our host has
Thank you.
arrived, which means we're out
Thanks,
of time.
Sharon. Thanks, Sharon. I'm really sorry to jump in because this has been such an illuminating conversation, and we could clearly go on for another hour or two on it. But it's an area that OEP will undoubtedly continue to address because it's going to be an ongoing set of issues. It's obviously got complex elements that need to be considered over a long period of time. This isn't going away in any shape or form. So we're very grateful to all of you, Melanie, Sharon, Morgan, Aaron, for your time today. And again, I think we will be tapping you in the future. I want to thank our audience for taking the time to join us. Again, encourage you to use our energy library. There's a lot of great materials in there on this topic as well as others, and take advantage of that. And finally, thanks again to our partners for their support. And I want to wish all of you a happy, healthy 2022, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event in the near future. So thanks again. All the best.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.